Well, everyone, I'm very, very excited to welcome one of my personal mentors, very, very good friend. And he was also my graduate advisor in grad school. He is the reason I do what I do. Dr. Bruce Sherrick, thank you so much for joining us.
Great to visit with you.
Yes. I know that you've already kind of introduced yourself as well with Craig, but can you just give a little bit of a background about who you are and particularly your research area?
So I'm a professor at the University of Illinois, and I get to have the privilege of running the TIA Center for Farmland Research. So I've had the most wonderful career at the University of Illinois, been there over 30 years now, and involved with a lot of different aspects with farm doc, with crop insurance, but all of it connects to agriculture, and all of it centers around farmland.
Why agriculture? Why farmland?
Oh, gosh, again, a series of happy accidents. I grew up on a farm, a small farm, and was convinced that I wasn't going to go back to the farm because my parents' goal was for us to each make enough money we could pay for our own college. And we all did, and went to Ohio State and, ran as far away from agriculture as I could for a while, and then found out that that was the most fun thing to do, and then took a job as a temporary job at the University of Illinois, and then I guess everything's temporary depending on how you measure time, but I'm still there now, thinking it was just going to be a short stint, but it's just turned into the greatest, most fortunate set of accidental decisions I ever made.
Yes, it's really funny. Just a little bit of background. I met Bruce when I was a student in his class, and I absolutely just was enamored by this man who could just talk so fast and by with so many different things. And I remember I had a conversation with him. I had decided to be a teaching assistant for him my senior year. I had a conversation with him. I had already decided about where I was going post-grad. And he said, "You're going to be back here in less than a year." 6 months later, I was back in grad school.
It's pretty easy to find the students who have such a absolute desire to learn and a need to learn and a need to contribute. I don't think it's a real tough call in your case.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that. Well, we are live in Des Moines. Just for everybody knows, there's about 12 inches of snow, it looks like, on the ground. But we are live at the Land Investment Expo, and you've given a little bit of background about this event, and you've actually been one of the keynote speakers at this event.
I have. I've been to the last 10 or so, and I've been, what we call center stage a few times, but it's always it's a great event. It's become a who's who in farmland investing, and people from all around the country and to some degree around the world who have a financial stake in agriculture end up here.
Yeah. And so before I get into questions, I would love for you to start by asking me the questions you asked the audience today.
So it's not just a gimmick to get to know your audience. It's a way to set up the point of the conversation we're about to have. And so that is, do you own any farmland? Would you like to own more farmland? Do you think farmland is too expensive to buy?
I do, yes.
Will you sell me your farmland at that price?
I will not.
Right. And so there's this gap between the buy and sell and the personalization of the asset class for somebody who is an active farmer. And that's understandable. But we've come through a period now where farmland in the Midwest is up 50, 60, some places more than that % over the last 2.5, 3 years. Excuse me. And so we have to actually begin to ask the questions in a more careful way about what does that mean, if anything, about where it's going. What should be the right response to, would you like to sell me your land? Would you like to buy more? Are markets sufficiently pricing land or not? How to make sense out of the inflation episode that we're experiencing? How to make sense out of the low interest rate episode we had? How to make sense out of the rapid increase in interest rates we did have? Why isn't there much farmland debt by an individual owner, but institutional owners have debt? All those things that used to simply be in the background because things are kind of moving along in a fairly stable way. Now we have to question them a little bit and say what's going to happen in the future.
Yeah.
On top of that, just to ramble a little further, if I may.
No, please.
We have to think about any asset as being some version of its discounted set of future expected income. And the sources of income to agriculture have been materially changing. And the simple ones to identify are pre-COVID, agriculture got a lot of governmental support from things like market facilitation program payments or payments for the trade war, or COVID relief payments accrued to agriculture in a pretty strong way. Or when people stopped going to restaurants and started buying more from grocery stores, that actually added to food inflation in a preferential way that was beneficial to agriculture, and on and on. And government policies have continued to evolve to the point of being even more supportive of agriculture, not just crop insurance, but also the other titles in the Farm Bill. And so all of these things on the income side look positive, except commodity prices have begun declining. And so that's the one big countervailing effect. In the next few years, we have small effects, but in the long run, we also have to ask what drives agricultural income. And part of what I talk about is the long-term thesis that there'll be more people on the planet. I think that's true.
Yes,
and I
agree.
think they're going to eat food. And these are the, a little bit of the quippy, sticky way of setting it up. But what people eat depends on their income. And as people's standard of living goes up, you eat more proteins. And so that's a big driver on income. The other two, of course, to talk about are inflation and interest rates.
Yes. Yeah, it was actually, you're setting me up greatly for my next question. So, it's currently 2024. We're coming off of, a period of very high inflation post COVID-19 pandemic. How has farmland performed the last 3 to 4 years post COVID-19 during this high inflationary time? So
the answer to that question could have been recorded back in 1971 and would have stayed the same till now. If we look at a 3-year, 5-year, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, or 40-year period, farmland's positive correlation with inflation is an unbroken record. There are only 2 periods where the aggregate return to think of a basket of farmland was actually below inflation, and that was sort of the aberration of 2009 when markets kind of shut down. We didn't know what to do. And it makes sense, though. You should expect that real assets will grow in proportion to the thing they produce. And the definition of inflation is the nominal change in a widely consumed good or service or commodity. And a widely consumed commodity, what could be more widely consumed than commodities, and what does agriculture produce? And so to some degree that happened. But the other thing that is new, and it's the only time in my 30-plus year career now where this has happened. The inflation one is the same answer. The source of and form of inflation, though, is completely different this time. We printed money for not producing things, and we have to then monetize any excess of that print. And the way you monetize that has shown up in equity markets and real asset markets primarily, and some other things too. But it's perfectly predictable, not terribly astounding. The question is, though, going forward, once we're through this episode, if we decide to get through this episode, kind of a Fed policy question, among other things, then I don't know how the asset class will behave on the back end of that after we fully monetized inflation. And when we look kind of like regionally, where have you seen the most growth across, the country? That's a fun question. It's not just a great question, it's a fun question. Again, almost sound like a historic retrospective here, but one of the first projects I got to do at U of I was help with the formation and setup of the NACREF index for farmland. And it's now 30 some years, started in 1991, and we have now more than 16 billion in the index and 1,300 or so properties, and it's a very reliable thing that we can look at regionally, by crop type, by management type, by underlying commodity. And so the Pacific Northwest has become kind of fascinating to me for its flexibility. The upper Great Plains, for their catch-up, they've really become a production region in the last 15 years that's more important than it historically was. California is really fascinating because in aggregate, there's some specific commodity problems. Almonds right now are still tough, apples, citrus. So you kind of can peg some of it to the particular commodity grown in the region, but the lake states and the Midwest and the Corn Belt have absolutely killed it in the last few years. And also on a long-term basis, if you were to kind of pattern out the long-term returns, those are the areas that have done better than the S&P 500, for example.
And when we look at farmland markets, not only are we looking regionally, but we're looking by crop type. So annual cropland versus permanent cropland. And particularly with permanent cropland, there are a unique set of risks associated with it. And we've spent a lot of time talking about returns, moving kind of towards the risk profile. What are some of the things that are unique to permanent cropland when it comes to the risk profile?
Well, gosh, in the Southeast, the easy one is to say hurricane can take down a 15-year-old tree, and it takes you a long time to get another 15-year-old tree.
Yeah.
So the fact that there's production risk that is longer standing and you can't replace it, a derecho in the Midwest will take down that year's corn, and that's it.
Yeah.
What happened? Nothing. Didn't affect the production value of the thing underlying it. But if you lose a pistachio grove because of water, or oranges because of greening, or a crop of vines to phylloxera, there are things you can't do. So when more of the value of production is above ground, the more risky it is, and hence why permanent crops generally would be expected to earn a little higher rate of return. Specific crops, not necessarily. And apples, as an example, there's been some significant varietal obsolescence. It seems like if the apple variety doesn't end in crisp, it's hard to sell in the grocery stores these days. But those kind of features work out like they do in any other financial market.
Yeah. Well, I mean, even when we look at citrus, the issue of citrus greening and disease pressure in that space, like it wipes out your crop for that
Fresh
year.
Market, Florida.
Yeah. And multiple years after that.
Yeah.
So we've kind of already touched on we've talked about your 3 I's that drive farmland values and farmland markets. So we've already talked about income, inflation. Let's move to that third one, interest rates.
Yes.
Give me a little perspective about the debt profile of United States agriculture.
Well, it's almost embarrassingly low if you were to compare it to industrial production in any other sector. So on the long-term side of the agricultural balance sheet, which is now $4 trillion, about 13.5% debt. And that's really, really shockingly low, but it's explainable. If you look through the asset class and why it has such low debt, it makes sense to the individual operator. It wouldn't make sense to an institutional buyer, perhaps, to have that low of a debt load, but there's still not a lot of institutionally owned land. But it's been a little bit immune to the increase in interest rates because there wasn't much borrowing to begin with. And if you already had a long-term fixed rate loan and interest rates otherwise went up, you're probably feeling pretty good about that. You might feel locked in, but the present value of your debt payments actually improve for you in that case.
No, that makes sense. And kind of touching on that space, looking to 2024, what are some of your expectations around interest rates and maybe subsequently farmland values?
So I love the quote that was, I think, in maybe the Wall Street Journal that said something like, there are 2 kinds of economists, those who don't know what's going to happen to interest rates and those who don't know that they don't know what's going to happen to interest rates. So I think there are still enough pieces of uncertainty that we can't really accurately predict. The Fed's signaling has been notoriously useless in terms of actual outcomes because of the other market factors that actually intervene. The dot plots don't seem to signal all that much, and expectations are partly used now to signal. So if interest rates come down rather than I expect them to, I think, and they have started moderating, I think you get the normal reactions from markets, you borrow more and so on. But what I do think will happen, whether we come down or not as quickly or not, I think interest rates will normalize. We'll get a upward sloping yield curve again. The forces behind that are just too great to ignore for much longer. I think the position of community banks and others with capital to lend, we kind of burned through a lot of the cash, the excess cash in banks. That's coming back or can come back, or you'll have more rational deposit and debt markets. So I think access to capital will not be a problem. And I kind of like to leave that part there. I think the impact of a higher interest rate means future income is worth less. And the expectation for future income being higher or lower have a natural hedge going on anyhow, though. In the same way that people will say, well, commodity prices are really high, you must have made a lot of money. Well, commodity prices are really high because yields were really low. The product of those tends to even out more than either side of that equation. And so it is with the effect of cap rates on asset values.
Yeah. And kind of going to that income piece, we heard from David Muth today from People's Company, really awesome presentation in the renewables front. Any thoughts from you about when you see the drivers for farmland values? Do you see the renewable space really being a driver of, returns?
So historically, the impact of ethanol on farmland returns has been pretty positive. And I think there's some expectation that other forms of sustainable aviation fuel, renewable diesel, and so on will help add that same additional demand to the oilseed side of the major grain production regions. But it's a more complicated thing now. Dave also talked about carbon sequestration and the amount of spend we're putting in the economy to green the energy complex. We don't have super well-developed mechanisms for that yet, though, so it's all out there, but it's on the horizon. And what we think we see is a little hard to put into focus yet. There are increasing pressures to have simple practice payments. So a commodity or a consumer packaged goods company that needs to say sustainably sourced fill in the blank might be more willing to pay for farmer practices. They'll pay your family to do cover crops or go to no-till or to do something that they can say was an offset to some other effect. As we get to more literally measured elements rather than practice payments, it will be a little harder to see how those markets sort out. They're not there yet.
No, especially when we look at the carbon markets, Dave was talking about it's paying, $15 to $20 per ton, and doesn't quite match how much it costs the farmer to actually incorporate those practices. The other interesting thing from his presentation that he showed was the map of the amount of space it would take to convert to get to that net zero, of how much land it would take in solar panels and wind turbines and all of these other renewable sources, and it was a significant amount of farmland. Do you think at some point there's going to be this debate of clean energy versus actual producing enough food for our growing population?
I think markets will sort that out pretty well. And I think the impressive thing about that way of presenting the facts-based version of this is to say individual companies all want to claim they're going to get to some net zero or some sustainability point and push it off into the future, so straight lining it feels sensible for a few years. Without considering the scale, you might think that's all achievable, but we've never done any production of anything that's net zero, right? That's not the history. And so maybe net zero isn't the right target, or maybe to get there wouldn't be feasible. But people are not very good at math with lots of commas, is the joke, right? So when you need 1 trillion of something or 1 billion of something or 1 million of something, those are really different things. And it's easy to promise until you do the math and then go, but then we wouldn't have any food. And so I think markets will be, when we get these priced, when you start saying to put up another 1 million acres of solar panels, it does what to our cost of pork? Then you start having real debates. Early stage, though, we tend to use subsidies or experiments or other things to try to encourage a change in behavior, and then find out how markets may or may not take over.
And people love that word sustainability.
They do.
And it's become such a buzzword even on food labeling. It's just like sustainable. And I really like Drew Bledsoe's point today when he was speaking about how he runs his winery and his definition of sustainability. And yes, it is kind of our traditional thought of adopting cover crops or more sustainable farming practices, but it's also creating a sustainable business and a sustainable future in food and for the people actually working for him.
I love that conversation as well. And sort of sustainability, one of the companies that I get a chance to deal with has a great mission statement, which is something like transforming the world to sustainable future through markets. So recognizing that to do so still has to make sense. You still have to survive. You have to make enough money for that to work, and turning it into the things where you make more money because, or you're more able to work in the future because, I think is a good way of thinking about sustainability.
Okay, last question. Are you long-term bullish on farmland markets?
I am.
Okay.
I actually am. So I think the short term is hard to predict. I think the long term is not that hard to predict.
Yeah.
I think a lot of it is priced in already, but I don't see anything that reduces the safety net programs for agriculture in the U.S. I don't see anything that changes the long-term population dynamics. I don't see anything that changes the long-term standard of living. And the most fixed relationship in history is that if you give someone hungry more money, they eat more food. If you give someone more money who eats enough food, they improve the quality of their diet.
Yeah.
And as you give more discretionary income to people, they continue to spend more and more on higher quality diets. And I think that in the long term is important. At the same time, we're devoting a much larger share of terrestrial agriculture to energy production. If you put those two things together, it's hard to find the case where that doesn't work out.
Yeah, I would agree. You know, as a farmer myself and somebody in this industry, I'm always bullish. But
So I'll go back to my first questions. So if land is too expensive, why won't you sell me your land?
Yeah.
And this
Well,
what asset would you rather own question.
oh gosh, nothing else.
Right.
And that it's kind of unique, not to kind of keep going, but the unique thing about American farmland is there is that passionate tie of owning property and owning it's been so closely held for so many generations that there is kind of that emotional element to it as well that's hard to quantify.
Indeed.
But okay, well, Bruce, thank you so much for your time today. We really, really appreciate it. And if people are looking for more information about your work, where would you direct them towards?
I'd start at FarmDoc, and you can find all of us at the University of Illinois on FarmDoc, and then sort through by topic, and you'll find naturally the right person. And if it's land values or crop insurance or capital models or insurance generally, it'll probably lead to me. If it's budgets, it may lead to Gary. If it's policy,
Yes.
It may lead to Jonathan. If it's commodities, to Scott. So I would say that's how you can find us more generally, because it's a great team, and it's I think a really unique team, and we're really proud of it and hope that you will find us and contact us.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate your time.